All right. So, what we have covered so far in these lecture two slides or the second chapter is essentially how payment can be made, what are the different types of mergers, but everything has been more or less from the perspective of the acquirer as opposed to from the perspective of the target. Now, if you're a target, what can you do to prevent a takeover? So, it really depends on the stage of the bid. If the bid has not yet started, or if you are concerned that there might be potential bids or takeover attempts in the future, you can engage with certain something called pre-bid defenses. And on the other hand, if the bid has started already or the takeover is underway, you can do something called a post-bid defense. So, in both of these cases, it really depends on the stage of the bid. Typically, a firm does not engage in just one takeover defense at a time. In your group assignment, actually, you will have to think about strategies to, based on what is the underlying factors of the company, which the best takeover defense is as one of the questions, as an example. But the idea is that you can combine multiple takeover defenses as if you are a target. Now, from the perspective of takeover target shareholders, that if you're a shareholder of one of these firms, then typically these defenses do destroy value for you. Why? Because there are multiple reasons. One of the simplest reasons is that takeover defenses are very costly. Often they involve destroying assets or engaging in harmful actions which might destroy the value of the company for the shareholder themselves going forward. Another reason is because share takeover defenses are typically engaged upon by managers who are quite bad, so or firms with a lot of agency problems, as an example. So it might be the bad management, or it might also be just the case that firms which are targeted typically are the ones which are underperforming. So one example that I have in one of the readings provided to you was the case of Blockbuster, which was taken over by Carl Icahn via proxy contest. And one concern with Blockbuster was that it was an underperforming firm. So, in that sense, these target takeover defenses can be engaged upon, but on average, they destroy value. And whenever I refer to any academic literature, be aware that most of these effects are on averages. It doesn't mean that in all cases they are going to destroy value, but it means that on average, as a shareholder of one of these companies, you will see your value being destroyed. One of the pre-bid defenses, surprisingly or funnily enough, is not precisely a pre-bid defenses. It's it can also be engaged upon while the bidding process is going on. It's referred to as a poison pill. So a poison pill, let's once again engage in this toy example. We have the case of Arcelor and Mittal a bit later in the slides. Mittal tries to engage in a hostile takeover of Arcelor. And what happens in this case is that Arcelor might issue these special class of securities that allows its shareholders to buy new shares at a discount. So, as an example, Arcelor might tell its shareholders that you can purchase new shares at 50% of their market value, or if you hold, say, one share, then you might be able to get an additional share for as good as free, that is, for a nominal value. So, in that sense, what Arcelor does is that if Mittal has come, say, around 40%, during the takeover process, and its shareholders exercise this poison pill, then Arcelor might actually end up Mittal's ownership in Arcelor might go down to something like 30%. How exactly would this work? Suppose Mittal starts taking over Arcelor, and it has taken over 40%. Arcelor has given its shareholders these poison pills, which are these special securities, and says to its own shareholders, now you can buy X percentage of these new shares at a nominal value. Then the initial base or the existing shareholders, before the poison pills are exercised, is around 60%. That is the ones not taken over by Arcelor. Once the poison pill is exercised, then these shareholders have gotten 20% more shares. And if Mittal does not exercise, or if it's not eligible to exercise, it ends up with 20%. So now what Mittal has to do is, instead of going to 50.01%, instead of having just to climb up a hill, which is just 10% more shares, it has to buy even more shares and convince even more shareholders. So the idea of a poison pill, to summarize, is that it's a security which allows the shareholders of the target to buy new shares at the discount. If you're engaging in something like a hostile tender, then the first thing that you want to do as an acquirer is to get to the majority point of the target shares. So in this case, Mittal wants to get to 50.01. But what these poison pills do is that they give an option to these shareholders of the target to basically buy more shares, which means that it's kind of changing the playing field, that this 50.1%, even if it has just been achieved, the percentage goes down, which is the case over here. Now, there are two types of these pills or poison pills. One is flip and pill, which essentially says that the shares of the target can be purchased by the target shareholders at a discount to the market price. The keyword over here being additional shares of the target. So Arcelor says to its shareholders, you can buy more shares of Arcelor at a discount to the market price, which is precisely the example that we covered right now. The second case is the flip over pill, which says that additional shares of the acquirer can be engaged at a discount. Now, this is a bit tricky. I'm just zooming in over here so that I can write clearly. So Arcelor has issued these sort of poison pills to its shareholders. Mittal has successfully taken over Arcelor, which is that it has gone to 50.01%. But Arcelor has within its bylaws. And what are bylaws? Bylaws are those laws of the company within the entire corporate law framework, which are created by the management of the company as well as by the approval or passage of certain resolutions at company meetings. So these are basically laws which are company specific. They fall under the ambit of overall corporate law, and they only affect that particular company. So the bylaws of Arcelor say that if a takeover is successful, or if takeover is, on its way to closing, then Arcelor shareholders can buy Mittal shares at nominal value. So as opposed to buying Arcelor's own shares, they can buy Mittal shares, which is a bit tricky. And the reason why this is possible is because for the transaction to go through, for the takeover to go through, the bylaws specify that Mittal has to comply by this particular specific bylaw, which allows Arcelor shareholders to buy Mittal shares. What happens as a result is that Arcelor shareholders end up with a controlling stake within the combined company because they are ending up buying more of the shares than they would receive otherwise. So that is a flip over pill. And if that was not clear enough from this example, we will do a numerical example in the next page, but in the next slide. But the idea is that the only difference between a flip in pill and a flip over pill is that the target, instead of giving the shareholders the right to buy its own shares, is giving the shareholders a right to buy the acquirer's shares, and it's embedded into its bylaws. The idea of both is to just dilute the ownership base of this acquirer and that thereby create more cost for the acquirer. Now, one way that this poison pill can work, can be escaped or can actually be avoided, is that the management can say, if, for instance, if it changes its mind and decides that the takeover should go through, the management also introduces a sub clause which basically says that the management can redeem the pill through a payment. So if your shareholders own this poison pill, so in this case, if Arcelor's shareholders hold this poison pill, then Arcelor's management, should they change their mind, can tell its own shareholders that we will purchase your shares or we will redeem this pill at a given value in, say, cash. So that will basically make this entire poison pill null and void. But sometimes the management itself may not trust itself, in the sense that it might say that there is no escape clause possible, so this option is not permitted, even if the management has changed its own mind. So it cannot be redeemed, and this might be legal based on jurisdictions. So to summarize, a poison pill is the specific type of a security. It's a takeover defense, essentially. And it comes in two main forms, both of which allow the shareholders of the target to purchase some shares at a discount to the market price, such that the overall cost of the takeover goes up and the ownership base of the acquirer becomes diluted. So one type is the flip-in pill, which gives the shareholders of the target a right to purchase new shares. Another one is a flip-over pill, which gives the right to the target shareholders to purchase new shares of the acquirer, which is typically embedded into the bylaws. And the way you can escape this poison pill, in case as the management of the target you decide to change your mind during the entire process. So as an example, if the acquirer comes with more favorable terms, or if the acquirer is more positive, comes up with a higher price, as an example, in such cases, there's something called an escape clause, which can be permitted by the management itself. There's, of course, the possibility that the escape clause might be completely precluded by including this dead hand poison pill, which does not contain any escape clause, but that can be illegal. Now, before we move on to a numerical example, the reason why poison pills are both pre-bid as well as post-bid defenses is because they can be issued at any given point. They can be issued while the takeover is happening, which makes them a post-bid defense, or they can be issued before the takeover occurs, which makes them a pre-bid defense. So before we move on to a numerical example, are there any questions? Okay. So let me provide you with one specific example of this takeover defense. Arcelor and Mittal. So Arcelor is being taken over by Mittal. There's this hostile tender which is happening. Mittal is going up to the market and trying to take over Arcelor shares by directly contacting its shareholders, and Arcelor wants to defend itself against this takeover. What it does is it has already embedded poison pills, or it embeds new poison pills as the takeover is going through. So let's first start off with what the standard case would be. This would be our benchmark in all cases. So first we would have Arcelor, which has say 1 million shares. These are 1 million outstanding shares. And then we have Mittal, which has also 1 billion outstanding shares. Mittal offers Arcelor, so the offer is a 1:1 stock swap. So the exchange ratio here is 1:1. Mittal will offer Arcelor one of its shares in return for Arcelor shares. So what are the number of new shares that Mittal has to issue? That is equal to 1 million. To get controlling ownership, it has to issue 500,000, a bit more than that. But to actually get complete control, it will have to issue 1 million shares. So the combined company will have 1 million shares, which are the original shares of Mittal, and new shares which are issued to Arcelor shareholders, which are once again 1 million shares. So what is happening in this case is that the new company consists of 50% of Arcelor shareholders and 50% of Mittal shareholders. Essentially, it's more or less equally split. So the new company will basically have an equal ownership split. The second scenario is when there is a flip-in. What was a flip-in? A flip-in said that Arcelor gives its own shareholders Arcelor gives its own shareholders more shares. And let us, for the sake of simplicity, say that these shareholders can buy 1 million new outstanding shares at very nominal price. So this is how the poison pill works. So what happens in this case is that Arcelor has 1 million outstanding shares. Stock swap ratio remains the same, which is 1:1. Mittal has 1 million shares. Now, the shareholders of Arcelor, all of them exercise this option or exercise this poison pill and end up with now 2 million shares. So the new scenario is Arcelor has 2 million outstanding shares. Where did these additional 1 million come from? These are 1 million existing plus 1 million poison pill, and Mittal has the same number of shares. So if the takeover has to go through successfully, so successful, then what is happening in this case is that Mittal has to issue 2 million shares. So Mittal's existing shares are 1 million. And it has to issue to Arcelor the new shares of 2 million. So even if the hostile takeover goes through successfully, Mittal's existing shareholders have 33%, and Arcelor's shareholders in the combined company have 67%. So the controlling stake now belongs to Arcelor's shareholders within the combined company. Now, before we move on, let me also state that First of all, because there are now 2 million shares to be taken over, the exchange ratio potentially will not remain the same. This is a very simplistic toy example. The second dimension is also that because there are 2 million outstanding shares to be taken over, despite the exchange ratio decreasing, Mittal will now have to purchase a larger number of shares to successfully execute this transaction. And as a result of that, we are going to end up with a scenario where Mittal's cost for taking over Arcelor are going to increase, and the base of the combined company is going to be diluted compared to what it would be in the standard example. So the poison pills are kind of diluting your own base at the cost of preventing someone else from taking you over. So this is the flip in. If you have any questions, just unmute yourself at any point and stop me, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, we'll take that as a no. The second one is a flip over. In this case, Arcelor has a bylaw which allows its shareholders to buy Mittal's shares once the deal is being closed at a very nominal price. Once again, let's keep this value at 1 million outstanding shares so as to avoid any scenario where we have too much complicated calculation. So the standard case is the same. It's exactly this. 1:1 stock swap. Mittal has to give one share of its own to Arcelor, and in return, Arcelor shareholders are going to get this one share of Mittal. Now, suppose the takeover is as good as successful, but for the transaction to legally go through, Mittal has to honor this poison pill. And Arcelor's shareholders, all of them decide to exercise this poison pill. So all of them buy 1 million shares of Mittal. That is the acquirer. So in this case, what is going to happen? There are going to be Mittal's existing shares are 1 million, or let me just write that down right now because you know where this is going. And Arcelor's shareholders are going to receive new shares, which are once again 2 million. So the 67%, which effectively implies that Arcelor shareholders are in control. But where do these 2 million come from? In the previous case, those 2 millions were coming directly from Arcelor's own shares being purchased by Mittal. That is, Arcelor suddenly ended up with these 2 million shares because it issued its own shareholders 1 million extra shares. In case of the second scenario, Arcelor new shares come from 1 million, which it directly gets from Mittal as a result of this poison pill, because it gives its own shareholders to buy the shares of Mittal at a very nominal price, and 1 million shares of that Mittal pays for as a part of any normal transaction. So this is just like here, these are 1 million existing shares. So the 2 million over here come from the poison pill, where Arcelor shareholders can buy Mittal shares, and the new shares issued by Mittal to take over Arcelor's existing shares. But the outcome, once again, just like in the other poison pill, is that Arcelor has a controlling stake within the combined company, and the shareholders of Arcelor are the ones who are really in charge. So this makes poison pills a particularly what you might refer to as a bit more of a dangerous strategy from the perspective of the acquirer, because suddenly the base of the target or even of the combined company is being diluted. Okay, so no questions. Now, one very obvious reason why poison pill may not be effective if it is not exercised. Because remember, your shareholders have to agree to purchase this. The second way in which it may not be effective, I'm just using a ditto symbol here, is if your shareholders are opposed to you. So if target shareholders unhappy. And what can your shareholders do if they're unhappy? They can basically help the acquirer engage in proxy fights where they can remove your own management or pass resolutions against your own management. So this really relies upon you having your own shareholders happy with you, which is often not the case in many takeovers. And as a result of that, a poison pill is often combined with other techniques or other methods. Everything clear so far? Okay, good. Now, the second way a pre-bid defense can go through, and now I'll speed up a bit because this is far too much descriptive stuff, is that something called shark repellents. A shark repellents is actually a category of takeover defenses, which are pre-bid defenses. And what these shark repellents do is they change the charter in a way that the management can still remain in control. So one of the ways is something called staggered vote. Think about the US Senate or many parliaments, where the entire parliament is often not up for election, especially in many countries, the upper houses of parliament, and only a few members of parliament are up for elections. Same thing holds true for these companies. All the management board members, sorry, there should be board members, all the board members are not up for election, but only a few are. How would this work? And more specifically, I mention over here, it's used to supplement poison pills and reduce the probability of proxy fights. So, how exactly would a staggered vote with a poison pill work together? Take a moment, think about it. It's not very complicated answer, but it would just put you in the mindset to solve a very similar question you have on your group assignment. Anyone? So the question here is, if you have a staggered board where only few board members are up for elections, and you have something like a poison pill, first of all, how would boards work on their own? That's the first question. The second thing is, how would you use a poison pill alongside a staggered board to reduce the probability of a takeover? So let's start off a bit more basic. What was the main issue with the poison pill? A poison pill essentially makes sure that you, as a The main issue was that your own shareholders might be opposed to you. Now, if your shareholders are opposed to you, what they can do is that they can join the acquirer in passing resolutions against your board. So they can replace your board through proxy fights. So what you do in this case is that when you issue this poison pill, is that you add a staggered board. Because even if your shareholders are immediately against you, because only a few board members are going up for elections every single time, the ability of an acquirer to replace your entire board at one go, even if it is with the cooperation of your own shareholders, is limited. So instead of replacing your management entirely now, they might have to wait a couple of years, by which point you have other options to engage in. So if you're a takeover, and think about this once again from the perspective of your exam and your case studies, if you're a takeover target, then you might want to merge poison pills with staggered boards so that you can prevent your entire management to be replaced when your shareholders are against you. The staggered board would basically prevent your management from being replaced at a go. The second way a shark repellent can work is cumulative voting rights. This is simply giving you a vote which is equal to number of shares owned multiplied by number of eligible directors to be elected. So if existing shareholders are giving this cumulative voting right, then you have something like a greater say in actually maintaining the directors. So instead of, as an existing shareholder, instead of just getting one vote, I end up getting two votes, especially if shareholders are not coordinated, which means all the shareholders don't vote. And say I have 40% of the company and the acquirer only has 20%, then I can exercise this so that I can basically, have an outsized influence within the entire voting process. Yes, Diogo?
Two questions. The first one regarding the staggered boards. How does this work in practice? So it's basically in the bylaws and they can exercise it at any time, or is there a specific procedure to do it?
So, first of all, the way a bylaw is structured, a bylaw always falls under the overall corporate law. It's not like an independent thing where it can override the corporate law. It's underlying the corporate law. So, depending on the corporate law of the company of the country, the way managers are meant to be replaced or meant to be, elected varies. But suppose within your bylaw, if you are within the particular corporate law, if you're allowed to elect all your management at one point, that is by passing a resolution, then at the shareholder elections, you can pass this bylaw which says that only say two out of say 12 shareholders, the 12 board members can be replaced, are up for election at a given point. So it can be through the corporate charter, it can be via passing bylaws, it can be by passing resolutions, and this is one of the reasons why it's also a pre-bid defense. It can be done before there's any threat of actual election or any actual proxy fight. So you can embed this into your bylaw. Precisely legally how this works really depends upon the specific country, but it's very much the case that you typically embed this within the bylaw of your company so that not everyone can be replaced at a given point.
Oh, okay, perfect. So it's about who can be replaced. I thought it was about
exactly
who can make it to the board. And about the second question, so the cumulative voting rights.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not quite understanding how this avoids the proxy fights, because like if for example members that have a lot more shares than the others are still against the merger or the takeover, can't they still act in contrast with what the management team is thinking?
Mm-hmm. So the way this would work is that, as an example, you can issue it to a certain set of shareholders based on the local law. In many countries, as an example, there is an equal treatment provision, which basically prevents everyone from, which requires all shareholders to have a certain set of rights, but it's perfect in the sense that you cannot treat different shareholders differently. But what is often the case is that you can issue it to say a certain preferred class of shareholders. You can issue it to all shareholders, which is less common. You can issue it to say it comes into effect after a certain period of time. So in that sense, it basically provides a certain set of shareholders more rights than other shareholders. And as an example, I gave the example actually 40-20%, and you're right, that doesn't fully illustrate this particular case. Suppose there are two sets of shareholders. 20% is the target, 20% is the acquirer. In that particular case, the 20% who is the target's main owner, the 20% who is the target's main owner, say, has two times the basically this two votes per share, and the acquirer, who has not yet fully acquired, has only one share, then in that case, the target has basically a bit more pull when it comes to replacing the management as opposed to the acquirer. So that's one way in which it could work. But this, once again, varies a lot between countries, because there are certain countries which do have equal treatment provisions which prevent you from treating different shareholders differently.
Okay, so it's a matter of choosing the shareholders that are more aligned with the management team, or am I missing something? So how is the choice of the shareholders being made, so that you can guarantee that they are voting on your behalf, on the management team's behalf?
One very easy way to do this is just to give it to a preferred class of shareholders, because as an example, if you hold like something like preferred stock, which is stock which has a certain which is not common stock, if you have like say preferred stock, if you just give it to preferred stockholders and all of those shareholders happen to be just if those stockholders just happen to be all pro management, then in that case you just issue it to those individuals. On the other hand, if for instance to replace the management you require only say you require a super majority as an example, then in that case you can play around a bit with the ratios. So if 40% receive twice as many shares, 20% receive twice as many shares, suddenly have 80 and 40, well, this is a bad example, but the idea being that by just issuing more voting power per share, you can disproportionately increase the voting power of larger blocks of shareholders. And to precisely answer your question, how precisely does the target know whom to issue? That really depends on the case, because the idea of this is that if all your shareholders are not in your favor, then in that case you want to issue this to the specific shareholders who are in your favor. So it really depends on who those shareholders ex ante you might believe are. So there's no one clear answer to that. It could very well just be like preferred, or it could be like block holders or something like that. But again, this varies a lot between countries because of the fact that there are provisions in corporate laws on how shareholders can be treated.
Yeah. Okay, got it. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. And the last method is actually something very similar to what Diogo was talking about, which is that, well, he said the opposite, which is it controls who ends up in the board, but this essentially changes the conditions of who leaves the board of directors. So it just changes the people who can be, the conditions under which they can be removed. Again, depending on the corporate law of the country, because certain corporate laws are very, detailed in the sense that they cover a lot of bases already. But if the corporate law provides you with flexibility in setting the threshold at which a particular board member can be removed, then in that case, you can have these for-cause provisions, which basically narrow the conditions for removing. You can change, for instance, the percentage. So the idea of all of these shaft repellents is quite simply that they are pre-bid defenses, which prevent the existing management from removal. Now, major downside of this is obviously agency problem. If the existing management cannot be removed, then you have got a major contracting issue in the sense that the management actually is going to be entrenched and thereby might engage in value destroying transactions. So just like poison pill, which dilutes your own base, or of the combined company, in the case of shark repellents, you might create entrenchment, and both of these are reasons why takeover defenses can destroy often shareholder value. Now, the third one is something called golden parachutes. If you were around, I'm pretty sure you were around the last financial crisis. This was quite a big deal, especially in the US. In this specific case of mergers, what it means, or rather what it means in general, is that certain employees get a large going away package or an exit package. And this is typically for a certain set of board members. Now, when there's a change in control, this going away package is triggered, and what happens as a result is that the cost of removing the management is very high. But once again, the cost can be borne by both the existing shareholder, or it can be borne by a combination of the existing shareholder and the acquirer. To give you a very precise example, suppose Mittal is trying to take over Arcelor, and the bylaws of Arcelor say that once you reach 40%, Arcelor's management receives, say, 100 million euros. 100 million euros as a golden parachute. So for each of the management, actually this is far too large, say 20 million euros for each of the member of the management. So suppose there are 5 of management members who have this sort of golden parachute, then Mittal is effectively ending up losing value of 100 million even before the entire takeover transaction has gone through, because the cost of replacing the management has gone up. So in this particular case, change of control is very costly for the acquirer, and the target, on the other hand, ends up the management is safe both ways, because either they stay in power or they leave, and when they leave, they actually are taking a lot of value from the firm away. One more reason why this takeover defense, much like the last two that we covered, destroys value for the company. Now, this is especially controversial because it, first of all, means that the rest of the employees are not receiving anything. But at the same time, in the US, even the management has to often pay a large, higher taxes. This should be surcharge, higher tax upon the entire golden parachute amount. Now, here you have a particular case where, in this opinion piece, which is from 1980s, it says that golden parachutes reward corporate failure. So you can look at this a bit later yourself, but the idea is that this golden parachute was given to the management of the company which was taken over. And where does this money come from? It comes from the company itself. So when these executives leave, they are leaving with a big chunk of the value of the existing company. So these are pre-bid defenses. We have 5 more minutes. So let me try to finish up the post-bid defenses. The post-bid defenses come into play when the transaction starts going through, which means that when the acquirer starts taking over the target is in the process of taking over the target. The first one is just that you pay the acquirer, kind of paying or buying off the acquirer. Once again, this involves the direct transfer of value from the target to the acquirer. And as a result of that, the target is ending up losing value because it's directly transferring this value to the acquirer. So this consists of purchasing these shares from the acquirer at a premium and imposing a standstill agreement, which is an agreement from the acquirer, which we, by the way, covered in the last class, to not engage in any more hostile moves when the transaction of the takeover is going through. So hostile moves over here mean that they cannot buy any more shares of the target. So in the Mittal Arcelor case, Arcelor would buy back shares from Mittal and it would impose a standstill agreement upon Mittal such that Mittal would typically could not basically buy any more shares of Arcelor from the open market anymore. The second is White Knight, which means you get a second acquirer to come in on more favorable terms. These favorable terms can be things like, certain terms with respect to the employees, direction of the company, or something like the management. So the management is not replaced. So instead of Arcelor, and this actually happened in the Arcelor case, Arcelor being taken over by Mittal, it approaches another company, say Severstal, and asks them to take themselves over so that they can get some sort of favorable terms, potentially say the management can stay in place or something like that. These are typically paired with lockups where there's a right to purchase for, say, Severstal, which is the White Knight, to purchase a large block of shares of Arcelor. So it's giving a guarantee to this acquirer. So in practice, the way this would work is Arcelor goes up to Severstal, Severstal agrees to be the White Knight or be the acquirer, and Arcelor promises, because Severstal is taking up such a big risk, that it automatically has a right to purchase a large block of shares. One reason why this might be illegal is quite simply because it violates the equal treatment provisions. The third is employee stock ownership plans. These are typically trusts, so this exists beyond the scope of mergers. These are typically trusts that holds the firm's stock for employees' retirement. And what these do is that these are issuing more stock or giving options to the employees to purchase more stock, such that the dilution of the base of the target occurs. So Arcelor, as an example, has a certain base. It issues to its employees these ESOPs. This is the shareholder base. Employees are issued ESOP, employees exercise the option, and then the shareholder base is diluted because now there are more shares. And the underlying assumption is that if you have more shares, you better be sure that the shareholders are in your favor, otherwise you're kind of striking your own foot with an axe. So last slide, and then I'll let you go, I promise. One way is that you just take up a lot of debt to buy back stocks or dividends. It's value destroying because what you're just doing is that you're increasing your own leverage, and then you might have to engage in a cost-cutting plan in the future. So you take up a lot of debt and then you buy back stocks. And what you do is, because you're buying back stocks or paying dividends, you are obtaining the support of shareholders. Just give me one more minute and then I'll let you go. Now, the other way is to just buy back stocks directly without even taking up debt, which means that you reduce the number of shares which are out there. Another way is restructuring, which could just be taking the company completely private or selling your good assets, once again value destroying. Or you can engage in litigation. So this is something which shows up a lot in the ArcelorMittal case, where you can directly sue the acquirer if, for instance, they have not disclosed information to your shareholders correctly, or based on political or antitrust concerns. So all of these are defenses that you can engage in, and if you see all of them or work through them logically, all of them destroy value. So here we have a particular case of ArcelorMittal. If you have not read through this, because this is required reading, please read through before the next class so that we can quickly answer these questions. And what we will also do in the next class is how to identify the value of sources for a merger and how to value a merger, for which I've put up the Excel spreadsheet. So within around, oh, actually we have half an hour more. I misunderstood the time. So we have actually half an hour more because it works till 12:30. Yeah, so What of these post-bid defenses do is effectively they destroy value for the target at the cost of preventing the takeover from going through. Now, this is a particular case. If you have not gone through this case, I'll just give you 2 minutes, say 12.3 or 12.4. Look through this through these two articles, and then once we return, try to answer some of these questions. All right. Based on your understanding of this, what were the, first of all, who is the acquirer and who is the target? This is something I already covered a few times, but who is the acquirer and who is the target in this case? Yeah, Mathieu?
The acquirer is Mittal, and they decided to buy Arcelor, the French company Arcelor.
That is perfectly right. And what takeover tactics were used by Mittal?
It was a mix between cash and stock.
So that's exactly right. Thank you. So the acquirer over here is Mittal, and the target is Arcelor Steel, which was a company based in France, like Luxembourg and Spain. Arcelor Steel at that point was one of the largest steel producers in the world. And the takeover tactics which were used by Mittal were, first of all, they started off with this friendly offer, which was unanimously rejected by the management of Arcelor. The second way that they proceeded was they engaged in this multi-tiered offer. And then they used other tactics such as basically portraying the management of Arcelor as self-interested. So it started off initially as a very friendly offer. It moved on to this multi-tiered hostile takeover, and there was a cash and stock component which was being used. Now, to give you a bit more of background on Mittal, Mittal Company was a company, I'm not sure where they're based at the moment, but as in legally, but they were a company based in India which had a history of taking over uh, underperforming firms and then essentially engaging in private equity type transactions where they would completely overhaul these underperforming firms. Because of their reputation, Arcelor Steel, which was a large employer based within Europe, um, was quite genuinely concerned, and at the same time, a lot of politicians were genuinely concerned about the takeover and what would result as a result of this takeover for all the employees of Arcelor Steel. Now, one of the reasons why this particular case is so interesting is because of the fact that Arcelor literally used every takeover defense that it could in the book to defend itself from the takeover by Mittal. And this leads to a second question, which is how did Arcelor attempt to defend itself from the takeover, and how did this work? So you don't have to go down each and every one. If you could just mention one of them, that's perfectly fine. So which takeover defenses did Arcelor Steel use?
They announced that they would pay higher dividends next year in order to raise the price per share.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any other takeover defenses which were used? Okay, so in interest of time, let me just run you through some of the defenses which were used. One of the defenses was personal attacks. So they, much like Arcelor was being portrayed as self-interested by Arcelor started portraying Mittal as this shark which was going to cause a lot of job losses. So this was a bit more outside the textbook attack, where they used the publicity or all these other dimensions to attack Arcelor and reduce the probability that its shareholders would sell to Mittal. Sorry, they used them to attack Mittal and reduce the probability that its shareholders would sell to Mittal. The other way that they dealt with this was they rallied the labor unions and politicians. So they approached the governments of the countries where they were based. And this is quite a common takeover defense, which falls into this litigation category. I'm not sure why it's not showing up, but this last line, if you believe me, is litigation, the one that I just ticked, which is using politicians or regulators to prevent a takeover from occurring. This is especially possible if, for instance, you are a company which matters for national interest or which matters for, employees as an example. So many times, even when steel companies are moving jobs abroad, often regulators get involved. This is not necessarily efficient from the market perspective, but nonetheless, it is something which is potentially useful for the employees of these firms. So they started rallying these labor unions and politicians because it was such a large employer at that time. It also tried to change the local law through its political influence to make sure that the payment would be via cash. And then it also tried to get Severstal as a white knight, a white knight being a third party acquirer. It also attempted to change bylaws. So something like, so try to change the bylaws such that they had to take over the majority of voting share. So sorry, they had changed the bylaws such that the majority of voting shares outstanding would be required to effect any change in the company rather than majority of votes actually cast. So this would be a bit more like shark repellent. And despite all of these techniques which were used by Arcelor Steel to defend itself, it was not successful in engaging in the defense. So it attempted to purchase its own shares. It engaged in personal attacks against the acquirer. It directly appealed to labor unions and politicians. It changed the local laws so that the payment methods would be changed. It approached a third party, White Knight, and it tried to change the bylaws to effect change within Arcelor. All of these, if you pay attention, are quite value destroying. Purchasing shares when it's not necessary is going to destroy the value because it's a direct transfer. Well, personal attacks may not necessarily destroy the value of the target, but if you are going to, for instance, change the local laws and well, actually, not even that one, sorry, but getting a white knight to come in will require you to provide some assurance to this white knight such that the transaction can go through. Similarly, changing the bylaws will also cause management entrenchment because even shareholders who do not want to sell will find it difficult. So out of these, actually, first, fifth, and sixth are very clear ways in which the shareholders of Target would end up losing value. And this answers our question, were these value destroying defenses or were they creating value for the shareholders? On average, these were value destroying defenses, which is why even when takeover defenses are successful, they often end up destroying value for the shareholders of the target. And the ArcelorMittal case is an extreme example where an acquirer who is quite aggressive can often work through the defenses of the target by paying a high premium, and thereby the target can often destroy value for itself, and the acquirer in such a scenario might also end up overpaying. So that pretty much covers the slides from chapter 2. What we have not answered at this point still is how do we value a merger and how do we optimally finance a deal? And given that we have last 15 minutes, and I hope my timekeeping now is much better than the last time when I mentioned this, let us try to move towards how to value a merger so that next time we can start directly with the examples and work through a spreadsheet. Are there any questions on this particular chapter so far? Otherwise, I will move on to the next one.
Professor, could you please just explain what is in number 6? I don't understand what it's written there.
Okay, so maybe I can rewrite that over here so that it's less ambiguous or less ugly handwriting. What this says is that changing bylaws such that resolutions require a majority of outstanding shares rather than majority of votes. So in other words, the majority of outstanding shares means all the shares that the company has issued ever, rather than majority of individuals who actually choose to cast the votes. This would make the threshold much higher because in most cases, all shareholders do not necessarily participate in the entire resolution passage. So this would basically create destroy value in this case because it would also lead to an unintended consequence, or rather potentially intended consequence, of entrenching the management and making changes in the company from the perspective of shareholders much more difficult.
Thank you.
Okay, so if there are no questions, then I will move to the next chapter. So the way this chapter is structured is it asks the question how to value a merger. So far we have been talking a lot about how mergers work, a lot of descriptive stuff and things like that. But what really the core of this entire course is how to value a merger. And remember, a subject like mergers and acquisitions can be studied from multiple perspectives. There's obviously a finance perspective, but there's also just negotiations within mergers, due diligence. There's also a legal perspective, and finally an economics perspective, which just deals with the economic effects of mergers and more like industrial organization. So the core of this course is how to value a merger. And in order to do that, we have to answer how do we value the target and the acquirer? How do we value synergies? We talk a lot about synergies, but when it comes down to it, we really need to be able to look at the financial statements of the firm and really say that synergies are arising from this particular place as opposed to elsewhere, because otherwise we really have a very abstract concept that we cannot place a number upon. What should be the offer price? Are these offer prices just coming out of nowhere, or are these offer prices just a result of some calculation? And how do we optimally finance the deal? So the way you value a merger, you might have covered valuation elsewhere, but what sets us apart is there are certain steps in valuing a merger. The first one is that you take the acquirer and the target as standalone businesses, which means that take all your existing knowledge of valuation about any company and apply it independently to the acquirer and target, and forget completely that these are firms which are going to merge. So if you are, for instance, running out of examples at this point, if you're talking about United, or actually no, let's screw that, talking about Heinz and Kraft, and they are engaging in a merger. Value Heinz, value Kraft separately, forget about the fact that they're engaging in any merger, treat them like standalone businesses. That's how we start off. So the whole process goes through. You identify the competitive environment, you find out a proper WACC for these companies, then you use whichever technique is the best suited. In this case, I mentioned WACC, so DCF, then you basically do the calculation, you apply multiple different valuation methods, and then you come out with the football field, and that overall gives you the valuation of these two companies as standalone businesses. The second dimension, which is where mergers play a big role, is then you merge both of these companies, so Heinz plus Kraft, and add the value of synergy or control to them. We so far have talked only about synergies, which is when two firms come together and operate more efficiently than if they were to operate independently. What is value of control? Value of control means that if Kraft is a poorly run firm and it's, say, incurring very high costs, then Heinz, by just taking over Kraft, does not automatically create any value by operating together. They just introduce discipline such that Kraft is now more efficient. To give you an example, if, for instance, Kraft is spending a lot of money on corporate jets, to refer to one particular example from the first chapter, then in that case, Heinz can swoop in, reduce management problems or agency problems, and basically make Kraft more efficient. The difference between value of synergy and value of control is that synergies can only be realized when the two firms come together. Value of control can also be realized when craft itself imposes discipline upon itself, which doesn't happen a lot, but that's the main difference between value of synergy and value of control. But we will talk much more about control in the next class, so we don't have to worry about that at the moment. Now, once you have done this, the next step is to identify the initial offer price. So where do we start off as negotiation, as analysts who are advising this firm to issue an offer price, and then you determine the acquirer's financing approach. So those are the steps in valuing a merger. What we will do, especially in the next class, is this and this. So the first step is standalone values. This is something I presume several of you have seen before. I would recommend brushing up through this valuation a bit more before the next class. Just use as many valuation methods as possible. You will potentially get different answers. The idea is just to get a ballpark sense of whether your initial valuation method or your preferred valuation method is accurate or not. The second thing that you do in this case is you begin with normalizing historical financial data, remove any extremes in terms of revenues. You can compare that to other companies. You can compare that to other companies at different points in time. And then you project normalized cash flows, which form the foundation in general of most valuation. This can be projection as percentage of the projected revenue, that is typically projection of sales. So you have, let's say, I don't know, I say marketing cost as a very simple example is say 5% of sales, then you will project this exact same value that way. This is something I presume you have done previously, and do scenario analysis, vary around different assumptions so that you can see under different scenarios what is the outcome that is realized. So this is something where a step where you value the two companies using all your valuation knowledge. And this is not something which is particularly new or novel to this course. What is new or novel to this course is to identify the value of synergies or value of controls. Because the main thing from a merger is this creation of synergy. So the first rule, the thumb rule that you have to use is to use net synergies. There might be negative synergies as well, in the sense two companies coming together might have integration issues, which might cause a lot of costs. So what you have to do is to actually identify these positive synergies minus negative synergies, and that should give you net synergies. Precisely the different types of synergies is something that is towards the end of these lecture slides. We do not have time to cover that right now, but we will have example after example in a spreadsheet so that we can precisely point out which line item in the balance sheet is affected by a particular synergy, and we can value it. Now, the way we can identify this synergy and value them is based on two approaches. The first one is you just take the value of the combined company, subtract the value of the acquirer and the value of the target. This is something you get from step one. So in this case, value of Heinz Kraft minus value of Heinz minus value of Kraft. So if, for instance, genuinely there is going to be value creation from a merger, then there should be a difference between these two values. So 1 and 2. And that would be the synergy. The second is to explicitly identify the sources of value, measure the cash flows that might result from these sources of value, measure the cash flows that will arise from these value destroyers, and take the present value of these. So that would give you also synergies. This is a much better approach because it leads us to more precise calculation, and it also leads us to, it's a more widely used approach. And in the second case, you have to explicitly identify the synergies, which may not necessarily always work out very well. If anything, a lot of value destruction or misvaluation of synergies results from these negative synergies not being fully valued correctly. Now, the third thing that you have to do, once again a bit more abstract, is you identify the offer price. So as an acquirer, let's once again go back to the Mittal case because that was a hostile takeover. If Mittal wants to take over Arcelor, the least that it has to offer to Arcelor shareholders is the present value of Arcelor. That is the lower threshold, the present value of Arcelor. The most that it can offer to Arcelor is present value of Arcelor plus all of the synergies. And then there's this big range in between where you offer present value of Arcelor plus alpha, that is certain proportion of this present value of synergies, where alpha is between 0 and 1. Is between 0 and 1. So you have to decide, after you have done this valuation and you have found out the share price of the target and the acquirer per share, exactly, or rather the target per share, exactly where in the range you will fall and what your initial offer price will be. So this is the initial offer price and what exactly you're going to offer. You're not going to start off here because at this precise point, the target is completely indifferent between being taken over or not because you're just giving them exactly the same value. At this point, you're giving up all of the upper limit, you're giving up all of the synergies, so it is way too costly from your end. In between are the places where you can actually share synergies. So if you remember the United Continental case, we had taken the assumption where alpha is equal to half, and that is exactly how we value the synergies. So the initial offer price will depend upon how much of the synergies you're creating as the acquirer, how much of the synergies the target is creating, so your bargaining powers and your bargaining ability as well. And that in general will give you the initial offer price where you start the bargaining process. What we will do, I think, 2 lectures down the line is we will have a wine country simulation. It's called Mergers in the Wine Country. It's a Harvard Business School case where we will simulate the entire negotiation process. And finally, the ability to finance. In the last 1 minute, let me just quickly point out, this is built upon whether you achieve the financial return objectives, the needs of the acquirer and the target shareholders, so that there is no downgrade possible. And for public companies, you're not issuing too many shares, so there's not too much earnings per share dilution. So those are the steps for valuing a company. I will let you go at this point, but next time what we will do is we will actually precisely identify the line items and work through an Excel spreadsheet. What I will do within half an hour is I will put up actually it's already there, it will be available to you, the group assignment. If there are any issues with the group assignment, please contact me ASAP so that I can change them. If you have any issues with access as an example, which I don't believe should be the case, please do contact me as well. The group assignment consists of a case study. There are some questions which you can answer already. There are some questions which you'll be able to answer next class onwards. And if you do not have a group at this point, what I would recommend is reach out to me as soon as possible so that I can actually assign you to a given group. Please email me rather than telling me right now because many times I may not catch your name. So I'll see you next Tuesday once again. If you have any questions, please email me. Otherwise, I'm here on call for the next half an hour as is our tradition so far.
Professor, do we have to submit the group composition, or
No, you do not have to submit the group composition. Let me actually stop recording now because we are past the. Yeah. So you do not have to submit the group composition. Let me just write that down so that I can put that in the announcement. I will find out about your group composition when you will submit the assignment. I think it's easier that way so that you have the flexibility to change your groups. However, you should not work between two groups. So if you have one group and the other group don't work with each other, because if the TA sees that two assignments are very similar, you might get penalized, or in some cases some action might be taken. I'm very opposed to taking action in general, but if there is an obvious blatant case, then we'll have to do something about it. So group composition doesn't need to be notified.
And are you uploading this class online as well, or is it just the other that will be uploaded in Moodle?
What would be your preference? Because I personally am completely indifferent. I was under the impression that any recording is as good as any other, but if you prefer, then I can upload this one as well.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't make a lot of difference, but maybe to follow exactly what we discussed, and yeah, I think it should be preferable. But anyway, it works. It works fine. So
no, it makes no difference because I have unlimited storage space, so I can very well upload this session as well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Sorry, just one question. What is the deadline for the delivery of the case? Is it 21 of March?
That is an excellent question. So what I will do right now is just quickly check. So it is in the group assignment instructions, which will be available within half an hour. But to immediately answer your question, it is wrong one. It is 21st of March at 12 o'clock. You can very well submit in advance because I realize your exam will be on 24th, if I remember correctly. So you can very well submit any time before that. So there's no worries that way.
Thank you.
So, Professor, just a question. Will you also upload the notes of this class?
Yes, I will upload the notes of this class. Yes, certainly.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So if there are no more questions, then I will go offline. If you do have a question, to mention it right now so that I can answer it. Otherwise, feel free to email me later. Bye-bye.